Hi, everyone. Just wheel a little closer here. I'm Lisa VISCIDI, Director of the Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industries Program here at the Dialogue. And we're here to launch our new report called Nearing the Tipping Point, Drivers of Deforestation in the Amazon Region. If you haven't had a chance, please grab a copy of the report out there. I really want to thank Matt Piotrowski, who's here with us. He's the author of the report. He is a senior analyst at Climate Advisors and an independent contractor who worked with us on this. I also want to thank ENRIQUE ORTIZ, Program Director at the Andes Amazon Fund, who wrote the introduction of the report. And we really enjoyed working with the Andes Amazon Fund in collaboration, and we're thankful for their support to make this possible. I just want to briefly talk about some of the findings of the report, but really today, we want to give you a chance to take a copy and use this as an opportunity to have a broader discussion about the issues, some of the issues that were raised in the report, as well as other issues. So as you all know, why did we think this report was so important here at the Inter-American Dialogue? The Amazon holds the greatest share of the world's known biodiversity, and as part of the climate change program, it's really one of the most important assets in the fight against climate change. Tropical deforestation accounts for about 8% of global emissions, and protecting forests is one of the most cost-effective ways to fight climate change. And the Amazon, right in the region of Latin America, which we focus on here at the Dialogue, holds half of the world's remaining tropical forests. And it's a really important opportunity for countries in the region to make good on their commitments under the Paris Agreement. But we've seen, looking at this, that all of the countries in the Amazon, either they're seeing increasing deforestation, in some cases at record levels, or they're seeing rates that continue to be unsustainable. And really none of the countries are really on track to meet their climate agreements. And so the goal of this report was to really focus on what are the main drivers of deforestation in 5 Amazon countries we looked at: Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, and Ecuador, which together make up about 90% of the Amazon rainforest. We also wanted to analyze current government policies to fight deforestation, and we provided some high-level recommendations on policy. So this was based on a literature review, interviews with in-country experts, and we also relied a lot on data from the monitoring of the Andes Amazon project. So we want to also thank them for allowing us to use their data. And of course, the specific drivers differ from one country to another, but we can see a couple of trends. For one thing, agriculture is accountable for the vast majority of deforestation in all of the countries, but the commodities that are being produced vary. So cattle grazing directly and indirectly produces the lion's share of deforestation, but we also see soy, palm oil, cacao, and coffee as major commodities being produced in some of these countries. And we also saw that land use is inefficiently, and so there can be a lot gained in more sustainable agricultural procedures and policies that could support that. But the agriculture sector is also a key source of employment, GDP, government revenue. So we also recognize that it's going to be a challenge. It's not a sector that can just cease to exist in these countries, but they have to really focus on more sustainable practices. We also looked at the role of illicit activity, which is pretty considerable as a factor, as a driver of deforestation, especially in certain countries, in really all the countries, but in particular, maybe Colombia and Peru. And Peru actually recently declared a state of emergency because of really an explosion of illegal gold mining. In Colombia, we looked at the impacts of the peace agreement, which sort of left a vacuum of governance in areas that were controlled by the FARC. And this actually contributed to a spike in land grabbing and unregulated agricultural expansion, which has really pushed up deforestation in Colombia. And there's also, across all the countries, we saw a lack of oversight, often due to inadequate resources being given to the environmental regulators. So we recommend that those budgets be increased and they be given the staff and equipment, et cetera, that they need. Some of the recent trends we think are worrying, and I want to ask our panelists to talk about this today. The president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, has actively sought to dismantle some of the monitoring and enforcement mechanisms in Brazil. We also, the authors also found that the construction of roads and other types of infrastructure have really opened up new areas of the Amazon that were kind of off limits. And this has led to new activity like agriculture leading to deforestation, and our speakers will talk about that today as well. And this includes we see the other actors also, but we see China having plans to finance and construct extensive transport infrastructure. And we think that it looks like over time, that could be an increasing driver. And the report identifies some policies that have been successful. So as I mentioned, sustainable agriculture and ranching practices, infrastructure programs that are more transparent and sustainable and require more stringent environmental evaluation and standards, expanding protected areas where we do see lower deforestation rates, improving monitoring, and really implementing. There are many good laws and regulations on the books, and in some cases just a matter of better enforcement. And we also think that reforestation programs could be strengthened, and there are some strong kind of economic incentives, like carbon taxes and offsetting carbon emissions that can achieve this successfully and at a low cost. So I just wanted to leave you with those ideas to really entice you to read the report. But now I just want to go straight into our discussion. So I'll briefly introduce each of your speakers. If you, in the QR code on your agenda, you can see their full bios. So I will just briefly introduce them. Tom Lovejoy is an environmental science and policy professor at George Mason University, who specialized in the ecology of the Brazilian Amazon since 1965. KRISTINA MCNEFF is a program officer for the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation's Andes Amazon Initiative, and she's focused a lot on the drivers of Amazon deforestation, including the impacts of infrastructure. Next, we have Rodrigo Botero. He's the director of the Fundación para la Conservación y el Desarrollo Sostenible in Colombia. And he's promoted strategies for land use planning and environmental management in the public and NGO sectors. And finally, on the end, we have ENRIQUE ORTIZ, who I mentioned is the program director at the Andes Amazon Fund and is known for his leadership throughout Peru and Latin America in biodiversity and ecosystem conservation. So I'm really very thankful for all of you for being here. And looking forward to hearing your thoughts. So we'll have a sort of conversation style, and we'll start. Tom, I'll start with you. I guess, could you kind of lead us off with a couple of minutes of your perspective of things, kind of how you see things across the region and what you think the critical issues are?
So I think the critical issue is inherent in the title of this report, which is that the Amazon actually works as a system, and it is being pushed increment by increment very close to the tipping point. It is an interesting contrast to what happened in this country as we pushed in westward expansion, ignoring John Wesley Powell's advice that west of the 100th meridian, where there was less rainfall, there should be different approaches to using the land. And then ultimately somebody cleared the last critical bit of native vegetation and tipped us into the Dust Bowl. And of course that then led to a massive effort to restore some of that and get the Dust Bowl under control. In this case, we know with a fair amount of precision that the Amazon makes half of its own rainfall. And we know that just the presence of the forest is important for maintaining that. But we know in addition that extensive use of fire and climate change are also impacting the system. And we are seeing, unprecedented historic droughts, 2005, 2010, 2015, 16, which probably are the first flickers of that tipping point. So nobody in charge of environmental ministries in at least the Brazilian part of the Amazon is paying any attention to that at the moment. I think it's an incredibly important bit of conceptual thinking and science that we need to really get out there. And of course, there is the really good news about it, that reforestation can build back the margin of safety, because it is not in the interest of anybody really in the end for the southern and eastern Amazon to convert to savanna or to caatinga, or for the amount of moisture going south of Brazil to decline and affect Brazilian agriculture in central Brazil. So that's sort of the rough picture, and we're sort of stacked up against a whole series of individual kinds of activities that on the face of them, when you first look at it without much background, you think might be reasonable things to do. But if you do the real economics on a lot of these things, most of them are not reasonable to do. And so that is part of the big dilemma here, is to think about managing the Amazon as a system, which means that each incremental decision is critical. Nothing gets left off the hook in this calculus. And so I'm so delighted to have this report, and thank you for holding this event.
Thank you. KRISTINA, as Tom mentioned, there are a lot of individual activities. Can you talk to us a bit about the infrastructure issue, which we saw has a lot of impacts on other activities? Maybe you could explain those links.
Sure, thank you. Hold it closer. All right. Thank you, Lisa. And just before I start, I want to thank you and the dialogue for the invitation, and to the Andes Amazon Fund for commissioning this study that brings us here today. With respect to infrastructure in the Amazon, historically, we know that approximately 95% of all deforestation happens within 5 kilometers of a road or waterway in the Amazon. And I think that for that reason, roads in particular have been a focus of conservation practitioners and a particular concern of conservation practitioners over the last many years. And I think that conversation tends to center around, is this particular development project or road and the economic benefits it will derive sufficient to justify the deforestation effects? And really, I would posit that that's sort of the wrong conversation to be having. And it implies 2 things. The first thing is that all roads, for example, lead to inclusive economic benefits. And the second is that deforestation is an unavoidable side effect of development projects. And I would posit that I don't think that's the case. And if we start to look at root causes of deforestation in the Amazon, what we see is a profound crisis in governance rather than an environmental issue. And in this way, I would say that deforestation in many ways is sort of the canary in the coal mine, sorry for the infrastructure pun, for these broader rule of law and governance issues. And we need to start looking at those in order to solve this increasingly concerning problem, as Tom just mentioned. And I think just for those of us who have come not from the conservation world, but from the infrastructure world, we're used to looking at infrastructure at a project level. We're used to saying, okay, how do we manage the effects of this particular infrastructure project for a road, the right of way, what kind of material it uses. But the issue in the Amazon is that it's not the project itself. It's opening up areas that really are fragile in many ways, and not just from a biodiversity perspective, but from a rule of law and a governance perspective. So if we change the conversation to addressing those issues, what does that mean for us in the conservation world? And what are some of the policy solutions we can look to help us move the needle on that discussion? Keeping in mind that, you know, we have a shared vision among conservation practitioners and the development world and governments to have a more sustainable future that includes an intact Amazon that doesn't reach the tipping point. And I would just like to put forward that I think there are two basic sort of buckets of policy solutions. And I think the first is around better development models. That's not anything particularly radical for someone to say. But I think we have to look at those development models both at the territorial level to address these profound governance issues, and also at the regional level as infrastructure projects get planned and conceived of, and what institutions are actually pushing those forward. And we don't have to start from scratch, certainly. There's lots of work that's been done, and I think at the local level in terms of governance, a really interesting basis for a policy solution would be some work that was done out of Brazil by Fundación Getúlio Vargas and the International Finance Corporation, looking at large-scale projects in the Amazon and how to have a local territorial vision for the use of territory when infrastructure comes into play. And I think those provide a really interesting basis, not just to better understand what local development needs are and economic visions for territories, but also to start to introduce locally run accountability measures and monitoring and evaluation of how governments are actually spending funding and how civil society and local communities can have a more active voice in those discussions. And the second, so that really is a locally led approach that can be done at a policy level. The second approach is more at the regional and national level, and I think that's with respect to the ongoing discussion about sustainable infrastructure. And that discussion in particular, I'd like to call out the Inter-American Development Bank for some really interesting work that they've done on sustainable infrastructure and providing a sustainable infrastructure framework that really prioritizes the institutional framework for planning and conceiving of infrastructure projects that are in service of a consolidated economic vision, rather than a project by project kind of opportunistic approach to infrastructure development. And I think with those two levers, and then read together with some of the really interesting discussions that have been happening at the G20 on quality infrastructure, that's sort of a nice package of policy level approaches that could potentially help us address the root cause of deforestation in the Amazon, which is this sort of fragility and lack of rule of law and governance. And then I think that the second area of policy that I would put forward is more around creating better networks of alliances around this deforestation issue. The scale of what we're dealing with in terms of deforestation in the Amazon is truly an all hands on deck problem, right? It's not up to conservationists. And in some ways, you know, it's not even fair to put this on local governments. This is an all hands on deck issue. It requires much better cross coordination around lots of different initiatives that are happening at the regional level, at local levels, in terms of, for example, decentralization. Decentralization efforts are huge in Latin America, in particular countries other than Brazil that are more centralized. How does the deforestation data help efforts to decentralize certain kinds of activities? How does the deforestation data drive some of the prioritization in that thinking, helping to inform where there are gaps in governance that need to be shored up? It certainly can be useful for that, and there's certainly an opportunity for coordination there around audit and procurement and fiscal functions. All of those play into this, to what we're seeing in terms of deforestation, in particular when it comes to infrastructure. So in that sense, I think there are lots of allies out there that we as a conservation community, but also people interested in sustainable economic growth, can come together around a common agenda.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a good segue to Rodrigo, because, you know, the issue of governance is not the only issue, but certainly one of the key issues in Colombia. So, Rodrigo, could you tell us about more specifically what's happening in Colombia?
Sure, Lisa. Maybe we can start talking about governance. Hola. Okay, we need to talk about governance because we have been now 2 years later the peace agreement, right? And maybe if you can see it in this map in the page number 5, there's any other site in the Amazon basin that has these areas with forest loss concentration. And if you have seen there, this is the heart of the armed conflict in Colombia, right? This is the zone that have been disputed by several years, and now there is a fight between the legal economies, legal plans, and maybe there is a large chain of different stages of deforestation, starting maybe with illicit crops, with some type of small ranchers or cattle, right? But if you are going through this border to the savannas or to the Andes, you're looking how the big ranchers and the agribusiness is now appearing. And then specifically in this case, in Colombia, we are looking how the oil expansion, the oil expansion and the oil palm expansion is doing a lot of pressure from the north for the savannas to the Amazon. And now this changing all this landscape in terms of how is it going through change the illegal economy to this legal agribusiness. And why is maybe this happening? Because we have there a lot of infrastructure plans, and specifically in terms of highways, right? All these zones that you are looking here, where the deforestation is focused, is overlapping the highways plans, right? And these highways plans is always related with agribusiness and oil industries. So we have here a contradiction between the developed sector and the environmental sector. The environmental sector in Colombia, you can see here, there is more than 30 million hectares between protected areas and indigenous reserves, right? But in this moment, there is a lot of new projects pushing agribusiness inside the forest, pushing the mining and energy matrix inside this forest. And we have not strong work between all or among all the agencies, not only the conservation sector, right? And of course, our conservation sector in Colombia is real weak. It's real weak, and they don't have enough power, political power, and also economic power. Here is Luis Gilberto Murillo, without the former Minister of Environment, and he knows that in the table when they are in the table with the other sectors, the environmental sector has not enough power to define which is the type of model that the Colombian Amazon needs. And needs according what we have doing the last decades in terms of create this strong system of forest and conservation zones. That's the first point. The second point is many areas in Colombia that has, and specifically in the Amazon, which has this deforestation, it's overlapping with strong groups who's mixed by legal and legal economies that is now doing the famous land grabbing. So the point is, not only deforestation is our problem. The real problem under the deforestation is the land grabbing. And unfortunately, the Colombian government has not starting with a robust strategy to do there, for example, the cadastro. We have no cadastro in all these areas around Colombia. We have no cadastro, and also we have no land titling processes that could stop this process of land grabbing, right? And the other side, the regional groups, and when I was talking about regional groups, it's a mix between illegal groups, armed groups, former paramilitaries, former guerrillas and dissidents groups. Many politicians in the regional level are exactly doing the opposite. So they're taking the control in these territories, and they're doing and they're putting a lot of people, a lot of families that is coming from the Andes to the forest, and they're putting their hundreds of families there in these zones, maintaining the control of these new lands that they have out there, illegal or informal property. But this is the market. This is the new market in the Colombian Amazon. And this is maybe the main economic activity now in the Colombian Amazon, land grabbing, because the Colombian government has no control, right? So this is one point that we need to view. The other side is we have not the enough commitment about the agribusiness sector, in terms that we have not the commitment to see where's the products of agribusiness going to in terms of the internal markets or the external markets. For example, we have a lot of production of milk inside the national parks. And it's clearly an illegal activity, and then the big companies they're buying a lot of milk inside the national parks or other zones. For example, in the indigenous reserves who has been invited by a lot of peasants and drug trafficking groups or other groups, and they're also producing a lot of agribusiness, right? And this product is going now and doing laundry, right, in terms of the internal and external markets. And the final, we have another problem, well, a lot of problems, but we have not exactly the best control in our borders. And it is not only a Colombian problem. Also, we can see this one in the Ecuadorian border, Peruvian and Brazilian border, and of course, in Venezuela, right? And there is a strong market of a lot of illicit products, not only gold, not only all type of minerals, coltan, right? Of course, wildlife trafficking, but also we're expanding these type of activities in our borders and creating a strong network of illegal activities around these borders. And it could be an early alert that we need to pay attention, right? Because it's creating a lot of sites and illegal economies that could expand this process of potential land grabbing in the future in these areas, because the borders are extremely weak. So this is maybe an apocalyptic view, right? But in the other side, okay, we're seeking that the Colombian government is also doing a good effort in terms of strength the law enforcement activities. It's a good idea, and it's a main strategy for them. The Colombian government should campaign this strategy with the land titling process and, of course, with alternatives of livelihoods and sustainable development, right? Because if they only put all their efforts in law enforcement, we're going to have a lot of problems, and it will be the opposite that where they aim to, in this case with law enforcement, to create a legalities framework. And of course, the regional and local groups have advantage for this, because they're doing both one. They're also doing their own bizarre strategy of enforcement. They're doing their own strategy of land titling in their way. And of course, they're doing their development, economic development, of course, with cattle, with mining, with coca crops, with the drug trafficking, right? Okay, thank you, Lisa. And so I'm trying to remark that the local forces in Colombia, and this is a mix between the legal and illegal forces, are doing well or better than the national government. And it's, for me, the big challenge. And it's a problem of governance, not exactly of a conservation sector or a conservation issue. It will be the conservation, and maybe the change of the trend and deforestation will appear when the governance will be recovered. And maybe this is the reason, because the Colombian government now explains its expectation about how will the rate of deforestation will change, right? It could be disappoint, but realistic. So we need to work together, like to look for how was the best way exactly to do a good partnership with our partners in the international cooperation, in the NGOs, in the private sector, right? But looking at, in this case, the Colombian environment, and specifically the deforestation process, is absolutely related with other sectors, starting with the law enforcement and with the land titling and governance process.
Enrique, please go ahead and tell us about also specifically the role of protected areas, what's happening. There's been a big increase in protected areas in Colombia and other countries. Why is that so critical? It's on, and you hold it close
Thank
to your
you.
mouth.
All right. Well, first, thank you for the invitation and also for all of you coming here. I'm more excited when I see faces that I don't recognize, because normally we are the same group of people, but it's good to see that there are many that I don't know. That's awesome. It's very hard to be optimistic after one reads a report and reads the recent news about extinctions, species in very endangered, the IPCES report. When you read a report also that even though we have made great progress, deforestation is increasing in every country that we have examined, in spite of all the efforts, international agreements, and so on and so on. However, I guess the older I'm getting more optimistic. It's normally the opposite. We see that today the society is much more aware of what's happening, and also in terms of protected areas, we have achieved quite a bit of a portion of the Amazon in particular under protection, be under protected areas or under indigenous lands. Interestingly, in the efforts in these days, after all the international agreements are focusing on restoration, and it is important to restore habitats, but it's probably more important to protect existing forests. I coined a term when I was invited to events on avoided deforestation. I started a line called avoided restoration. Basically, it's protect lands before they need to be restored. And that's what we're achieving today with protected areas. We have you saw in the report that, together with indigenous lands, we are probably close to 40% under some sort of protection. And when I say protection, I mean under a legal framework that is aiming to sustainable development. That involves areas that are not only national parks, but also areas of multi-use. And it's important to see that the numbers haven't slowed down. The numbers actually of protected areas are increasing. And again, all sorts. But most of them in the last years have been areas that are for multiple use. And it is important to realize that there is a shift in emphasis. And there are not many huge lands to be protected as before, like 5 million hectares national park, only a few exceptions like Chiribiquete, ex-minister Murillo, one of the fathers of the protected area. There are those opportunities don't happen that much anymore, but there are many good opportunities that are appearing at the subnational levels and also for multi-use areas. So protected areas are, comparatively speaking, effective in conservation of biodiversity and protecting forests. There have been a number of critics about saying that you guys, we at the Andes Amazon Fund, are engaging to supporting governments to create areas, about why are you creating more paper parks? And even paper parks are very effective. The rates of deforestation in protected areas of different sorts is actually way lower than areas that have no any legal protection. Just the legal framework works to some level. Of course, implementation of protected areas is the next step. But the main point is that protected areas are very efficient in protecting, in avoiding deforestation and protecting forests. interesting that most of the deforestation is happening not within but outside of protected areas, and the largest amount of deforestation is in buffer zones, the areas around protected areas. Interestingly, the buffer zones in the strict protected areas are higher. The deforestation is higher in areas that are strictly protected as opposed to areas that are multi-use, say where there is managed forestry, managed fisheries, and so on. Indigenous areas also have been also very effective, and you probably have seen the famous photo of Xingu National Park in Brazil that is surrounded by soybean areas, and it works. It's the only parts that actually have any forest. It works very well. However, in some countries, deforestation within indigenous areas is also pretty high. In fact, in Peru, deforestation in indigenous lands is higher than protected areas, interestingly. What's the future of protected areas? Well, as I said before, the numbers are still continue to be growing. Countries like, for example, Bolivia, is just about to create something in the order of 2 million hectares. Colombia recently had major strides, Peru, and pretty much in every country, there is quite an interest in governments to create protected areas, but most of the recent developments are for areas that are multi-use. Again, areas that allow people to be inside and also establish managing practices that benefit people. One of the issues that we are kind of scared these days is under Bolsonaro's presidency in Brazil. There have been a number of threats about revising the protected area system in Brazil, not only undo protected areas, but also lowering the budgets for the agencies in charge of protected areas at the levels that are very dangerous, sometimes even below 50% of their budgets. That's a scary situation that we're seeing today, but this is resulting also in a lack of enforcement. But there are some positive signs. I'm just coming back from Peru, and Meg Hamilton was with us in the last few days. Peru just launched a new fund, and I guess it's a political push to enforce and also strengthen the protected areas in the country, which also equals what is happening in Colombia with Herencia Colombia. It's also a similar effort like happening in Brazil with ARPA. So there is and also there are other countries in the region are also starting to think about what is the future of protected areas. How do we make them more effective? And that's something that is an important detail. As KRISTINA was saying, governance is still an issue, is the main issue of all, in my perspective. I've been involved in illegal mining for quite a while. Probably some of you have seen one of the movies that was created, Amazon Gold, or also the second version of it is called River Gold. And I've been in the presentations of that movie in different parts, so much in South America as here in the US. And normally people come and make, at the time of the questions, people say, if you don't solve poverty, you don't have any options. And I'm always fighting against that argument, that poverty is directly related to deforestation. In fact, the numbers are growing, but poverty is actually being reduced if you look at the economy in other countries in the region. So it's a bit contradictory. It's more about the low-hanging fruits. When there is a lack of governance, people just go and take it. So anyway, I want to be optimistic, but there are many challenges ahead. One of them is that we need to show that, number one, protected areas are part of the economy, are part of the country's economic development plans. A recent study done by CSF, Conservation Strategy Fund in Peru, for example, showed that the direct and indirect impacts of tourism in protected areas represent $1.2 billion a year. If you put it in a context, the logging industry in Peru represents $200 million a year. So tourism is six times larger than those industries. And of course, mining is is the largest industry in countries like Peru, or pretty much in the whole region. But the difference in terms of economics, of protected areas, tourism, and economic activities is not that far from what we all perceive to be the major motors of the economy. So we need to show that protected areas are part of the development, and with the hope that, when we realize that, then is when protected areas will have more support and more political, clout to prevent what is happening today.
Thank you. Well, we have a few minutes. I want to give time for questions from the audience, but I'd like to ask a few follow-up questions first. And Tom, I'd like to start with you. I would like to talk more about Brazil because, of course, it is the most important country in this conversation. Can you explain, Brazil has seen a big decline in deforestation. In the last few years, we've started to see an upward trend. I was wondering if you could explain kind of the policy context. Why did this happen? And with President Bolsonaro, what are the key changes? Enrique mentioned a few, but what are your biggest concerns on the policy front, and what impact do you think they'll have, and over what time period? That's a lot packed into one question.
Well, the first part of it is relatively easy. So the increase pre-Bolsonaro was just because of budget cuts. So there was less money for enforcement. And of course, there's always been sort of at least a level of activity in alternate uses of the land that lead to deforestation. So you put those two together and you get an increase. I think what's most concerning right now are the various pronouncements by the Bolsonaro government, and particularly the Ministry of the Environment. A whole series of things which may, in fact, we can hope anyway that they will be hard to actually implement. So as worrisome as those kinds of things are at the level of the federal government, I think there is some real opportunity at the level of state governments in the Brazilian Amazon, and we should be working hard at working with the state governments and looking for those kinds of opportunities. And then lastly, I think it's time to actually have a major report with a new vision for the Amazon coming from something like the Inter-American Development Bank, which I'm going to suggest, because I thought of it while listening to all of this morning. It needs to be sponsored by an organization that has stature, that's different from what an NGO can bring to it. So I think that could be a very constructive kind of thing to try and change this dialogue.
Well, I think, KRISTINA, I don't know if you want to add anything as well on Brazil, but I also wanted to ask you about how you see China's role, especially since you were talking about infrastructure, and talking about places like the Inter-American Development Bank that give loans using kind of very specific and strict requirements for infrastructure loans. Are you concerned that China will come in with a different approach and with different standards? Or do you think maybe the concern is overblown? What do you think about that?
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you for the question. I just would like to add quickly to Tom's comment. I think recently at the Governor's Climate Forum, there was quite a bit of recommitment on the part of subnational officials to further a sort of deforestation-free or minimizing deforestation development models. So I agree that there is lots of opportunity at the subnational level not just in Brazil, but across the basin. And building on that, with respect to China, I'm assuming that you're speaking of China as the sovereign China, as the government of China. And I think that when looking at China's intervention in the basin, as with many actors' interventions in the basin, they're very different depending on the country that we're talking about. And I think that what we've seen over time is that for places like Peru and Brazil that have a very high trade volume with China, there's one set of interests. And then for Bolivia and Ecuador, which have a different kind of dynamic with China, more reliant on sovereign debt, it's a different kind of dynamic. But I think, as we analyze China's investment, at least in the infrastructure space, what we see is that China's deferential posture to national frameworks, it provides an opportunity again for the strengthening at the national level and subnational level for governance and rule of law within countries. I also think that from a risk assessment perspective, China's view is long game, which is a little bit different than the shorter view that we're seeing a lot with countries sort of trying to fill infrastructure holes that they see in the immediate term that don't really serve a long-term sustainable economic vision. And so reading all of that into context, I actually think there are lots of opportunities with China if it's willing to invest in the region in two critical ways. First, I think we've heard in the past few weeks, particularly with the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing a few weeks ago, there's an increasing interest by Chinese governments to really focus more on transparency issues and rule of law issues as sort of a risk assessment matter, and also on environmental sustainability. And certainly China has done amazing things domestically in terms of increasing its environmental performance. So I think if we can hope that those domestic gains will influence external policy, there's opportunity there. And the second area of opportunity, I think, is really for governments in the basin to define what kind of infrastructure needs they have in service of a long-term sustainable economic vision. And I'm hopeful that China will be a willing partner and that governments will also engage in that discussion in a helpful way. I think there's some opportunity there.
Right. So China's role, it is evolving, so there are opportunities. Rodrigo, I wanted to ask you, what would you really say is the key difference between the conservation policy of the Santos government and the conservation policy of the Duque government? And I also want to specifically ask, in terms of this question of subnational actors, I actually met with one of the vice ministers of environment of Colombia in February, and he said that one thing that was different about their approach is that they are more out in the territories, trying to work more with capacity building with the different department heads. It looks like you maybe don't see that, but so do you think that there's a real shift in policy, and what do you think the main difference is?
Well, maybe not. There is not a lot of differences. Maybe it's the Santos administration did a lot of efforts in terms of the expansion of the national parks, creation of new or expansion of the indigenous reserves. They push also the creation of the carbon tax. They also create the legal framework for the agriculture frontier law, and it was important. But they don't put money. They don't put the budget. They don't strengthen the capacity building of these agencies to do this work in the territories. With the Duque's administration, I think they are maybe trying to focus their efforts in law enforcement. but only in the military way. And I think it would be dangerous, as I said recently. In both administrations, they have several programs and projects doing with the international cooperation, right, in terms of maintain their capacity to work with local communities. And it's okay. They're good programs. They're success stories. But the point is that one deal is how do you work with local communities that maybe is not the problem in deforestation. And I agree with Enrique. The deforestation problem now is with strong groups who have economic power and political power. And this is not the strategy now. And if you look in the strategy now, they're looking more than to do enforcement with farmers or local groups. And so, in any case, in Santos administration and Duque administration, they're not looking for to enforcement with the political groups and the economic groups that is involved with deforestation. They don't have real presence with the environmental sector or other agencies, including the enforcement, in the border of deforestation, including the army forces. So it's very strange because this is the typical two language, right? One speaking about conservation, deforestation commitments, climate change, and on the other hand, looking how this territory is being captured by this type of groups and this type of development. So, and I don't know, I don't see anything of difference between all these governments. And I need to say that this is not only a problem or a case in terms of Duque or Santos administration. I've been working in the Amazon during the last 30 years. So we have seen a lot of governments, and this is a permanent problem of the Colombian state that don't have the capacity to do another type of involvement in the field, in the territory, and create governance capacities in the regional governments.
Right, yeah, I mean, I think the issue of illegal groups and weak governments, it's a problem in not just conservation, but really for everything. It's a big challenge. And Enrique, maybe related to that, in Peru, I was wondering if you could talk more about the impact of illegal gold mining on deforestation and what you see the government in Peru doing about it there, and if you think it's going to be successful.
Right. Oof. Well, illegal gold mining is exploding. I mean, it's growing tremendously, and not only in Peru. I mean, I've seen recent images in Venezuela, and it's really, really, really depressing. You know what's happening in the Caura, in Canaima region is like amazing. So what is happening in Peru has attracted a lot of media, but it is all over. As I mentioned before, I was involved actively in this field, and for a while I gave up. I don't give up easily, but in this case, I didn't see much of a political interest. And truly, if I was a politician, it's a very difficult issue because it is spread all over, and with a weak governance, the illegal miners are managed by big mafias and also are funding, a number of them, and they could create a lot of political issues like riots, and it has happened before, and no one wants that. But being on the optimistic side, in Peru in the last few months, only in the last 2 months, I think it's 2 or 3 months already, the government actually has shown a commitment in focusing on the enforcement and basically sending the army to the main area of illegal gold mining, which is Madre de Dios, in the border with Bolivia and Brazil. But this time is different because the efforts are not only military, but also are focusing on strengthening the judiciary system in trying to control what's happening, and also focusing on the sources of money, and of course on the sources of mercury, which is, as you know, is used in gold mining. The difference is that this time they came for a long time. Not as before, where they show up only for 3 days and then they leave and then the miners come back. They just hide the machinery in the bush and then just come back. Now this one is for good, we hope. However, if you put deforestation related to gold mining is probably a smaller part of what is deforestation related to other issues, related to infrastructure or what they say small agriculture development. It's actually a small fraction of what is the national levels, even though it has received a lot of attention, but it's not really the main one. However, mining has to be seen not mainly as an environmental issue. It is more a health issue. It is a family's issue. It is about society, the degradation of society. And during the years, I've been sort of advising, I think, 4 ministers about what a mistake is to have the Minister of the Environment coming out and saying and talking about gold mining when should be the Minister of Women, should be the Minister of Health, should be any other minister except the one of Environment. And it's a mistake to be relating that because we like it or not, environment is weak in terms of political power. It is more about, economic issues. It is about how much mining, illegal mining and poisoning with mercury is basically wasting a generation. How many people are suffering health issues. And that costs money. We have to put it in those terms more than how many hectares have been cleared. But, being optimistic again, trying very hard, the recent events give you hope. However, it's not much is happening in Colombia, is my understanding, and again, it's pretty much widespread all over.
Thank you. Well, that's very interesting. Well, I'm going to take some questions from the audience. So I'll take a few questions together so that each person can have a chance to respond to whichever one. We have a lot of questions. So I guess we'll start over here, and then there are 2 back there. So please just introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Doug Hertzler. I work with ActionAid, and we work with communities in the northeastern Brazil in the Cerrado. And my question was just, is there any risk in narrowing the focus? Well, the Amazon is obviously very big, but narrowing the focus just to the Amazon when you have actually U.S. investors buying newly deforested land in the northeast Cerrado and saying, well, it's okay because it's not the Amazon. And so I just want some reaction to that.
Yeah, great. Woman over here.
Hi, Cristina Burelli. I'm from Venezuela, but I work here in DC. And what strikes me is that, everybody's super stressed out about Bolsonaro, and yet there's no mention of Venezuela in this report. And I mean, it's so striking that even this little map up here in the corner, Venezuela's white when it should be green. It's part of the Western Amazon. The Chavismo, for 2 decades, illegal mining and legal mining has gone from bad to worse in Venezuela. In 2016, Maduro decreed el arco minero, that's 112,000 kilometers squared, and that's legal, quote unquote. And then in this Red Amazónico report, which you quote here, they said that the country with most illegal mines is Venezuela, and yet there's no mention in this whole report. So I'm struck by that. Why?
Well, in terms of the countries selected, it was based partly on which countries actually had the largest share. So we left out some that had a very tiny share of the Amazon. And it was also based on access, the information and data that was available to us. But, I mean, in general, the environmental degradation in Venezuela is really terrible and I think needs to be looked at in much greater depth. Yes, yes. Well, it's not within the scope of this report, but it absolutely needs to be looked at.
We struggle a lot with that. We discussed that issue
Yeah.
before.
Yeah. Okay, a lot of questions. I guess we'll go over here.
Thank you. I'm Luis Alberto Salgado. I'm human rights lawyer. I'm Peruvian. Just wanted to ask any of you if you would like to answer, comment, to which extent international politics, that is to say, the variable of the governments in China or in the United States or in Russia influences this struggle to protect our forests, to protect our environment, to protect our humanity. Because Bolsonaro is an ally, obviously, and he's compared as he's the Brazilian Trump. Okay? Well, that tells us a lot. We can see politically and we can analyze. We don't have to be experts to understand that. But with that same token, will it be interesting that when you approach to these kind of problems, because they say, hey, we have to protect the Amazon basin, and what is the United States government doing for humanity? What is the Chinese government, although you said there are important advances in connection with that. So my question is, to which extent it is advisable to involve a political analysis concerning the behavior of the superpower of the world in connection with these issues? Because it affects. I heard these arguments, this narrative before. Hey, you are forcing us to protect our basin. What are you doing as the superpowers to protect the earth? So don't give us that demagogy. Okay? So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's take one more over here.
Good morning. My name is Daniela Rake. I oversee the programs in Central and South America at Conservation International. And I wanted to follow up on, Enrique, your comment about avoided restoration and the need to protect land. As I'm sure you're aware, and Tom, you're certainly aware, tomorrow in Science, a paper's coming out that documents occurrences of protected area downgrazing, downsizing, and degazettement in the United States and across all of the Amazon basin. And, I think many of us sort of assume that protected areas are permanent fixtures on the landscape when in fact they're not. And they are shrinking, they're becoming less restrictive, and they're disappearing altogether. Now, luckily, the creation, expansion, and management of protected areas is still outpacing the downsizing, downgrading, and degazettement. But, this is a fact, and with the type of rhetoric that we're hearing out of Brazil and other places as well, there's certainly a possibility, if not a probability, that it will continue and occur more rapidly. So I'd just like to hear your comments on that.
Thank you. Well, if you could each just answer very briefly, we'll have time to go to more questions, and you don't need to respond to all the questions, but I'll just remind you there was the question about other areas outside of the Amazon, like the Cerrado in Brazil, the question about Venezuela, about the role of external actors, and about downsizing protected areas. So Tom, would you like to start? Just respond to whichever you'd like.
So let me just touch on the other kinds of ecosystems beyond the Amazon. Of course, they're important, and there are various activities going on to move things more in a good direction. But I think, the reason we're having this discussion here is that the Amazon is a big piece of how the planet works, and it has to be managed as a system. And focusing on that is not intended in any sense to say that the rest of the planet and its biology isn't important.
Just to add, we could have the same event for marine areas, for dry forest, for any event, but we just had to narrow it somewhere. Otherwise, when you try to cover everything, it gets lost. Can I start with answering a couple? First, let me say one thing about mining. You know, what you see happening in every country when they talk about illegal gold mining, the way to solve it is legalize it. And that's, I don't know who are we fooling with that story, you know. It still uses mercury. I mean, they're illegal, the small scale mining doesn't work without mercury. I mean, there have been many attempts and only work for the documentary. I mean, in economic terms, doesn't work. So the legalization is just, it doesn't work. You know, it has to be more about stop it. You know, I don't see intermediate perfects there. But anyway, that's my opinion, and that's what I've seen in the field, and I've been in the field. Regarding the issue of degassetting, you know, definitely is something that we need to keep an eye. You know, I wouldn't lose sleep for that, but definitely is something that we have to keep an eye, especially now in the Bolsonaro time. Unquestionably, you know. However, in relation to the idea that, you know, there is a lot of degradation, I'm sure there are some areas that are being cut, but still if you look in the larger, landscape is a smaller problem than other problems. But definitely, you know, I fully agree that we need to keep an eye on that and try to fight it. However, if you look at the history of protected areas, most of them are still there. There are only a few that have been undone. And even though many suffer degradation and so on, in most cases it doesn't go over 5% of it. So still they work, even being paper parks. I actually, using one of the questions, I wanted to ask Tom more about Tom, what do you see about, you know, when somebody said if Brazil sneezes, everybody gets a cold, you know, in the region. You know, the issue of Bolsonaro's rhetorical arguments these days, is that a danger that basically a populist perception is going to spread around? You know, we see elections coming probably soon in Peru, in Bolivia, and also governor's elections recently. I'm a bit concerned about that, but so far hasn't happened that much. You were talking about international politics, yet that still we haven't been influenced that much by Brazil. Even though last week in Uruguay, you know, the Brazilian government, one of the directors went and just trashed everything that we have been talking about before in Kyoto. But anyway, I could say something about the other ones, but I just don't want to.
Well, let me just answer that directly. So, I mean, it's a really good question. It's an important question. I have no idea, but I worry a lot about the role of social media today. I think it's making a lot of these things possible because too many people live on something that's even shorter than a soundbite.
When I read the other day that there is 20,000 miners in Yanomami Reserve. That's really heartbreaking.
Christina, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I would like to respond just to the question about the role of the United States and China and Latin America. I think there's some interesting developments, at least in the infrastructure space, on this very question. You know, the increasingly desirable goal of having OECD membership brings with it a number of sort of basic requirements to actually meet those goals, and so I think that the multilateral space is not totally thrown out the window. We're seeing even for Bolsonaro in Brazil. The second thing I would say is that, you know, with respect to infrastructure in particular, there is an increasing understanding that to attract the most competent and sophisticated kinds of contractors that can actually deliver on an infrastructure project with, you know, if it has an economic logic and if it has appropriate safeguards, you know, that's expensive. And often governments don't cost those in properly. So I think, you know, the United States government has been really at the forefront of sort of trying to get full life cycle costs, including prior informed consultation, costs associated with that, costs of safeguards, into infrastructure development planning to sort of raise the floor, if you will, on how those projects get bid out. And so while that's a little bit more on the soft side, I think it's an interesting development. But I don't opine as to the power dynamics there. Those have existed long before any of us were even born. So.
I want to take the question about what's happening in the Cerrado and the savannas del Beni in Bolivia, and also in the savannas in Colombia. Well, this is the areas where it's focusing now in agribusiness, right? And absolutely the Chinese and the U.S. investors are looking there to buy lands. And of course, this market of lands is now spreading to the Amazon, right? And maybe it's the key point about what's happening with this speculation, with this land grabbing market. It is a result of the expectation for this expansion coming from the savannas to the forest. So it's clear that it's not enough commitment about these investors and not only the U.S. government, also the Brazilian investors. There's a lot of companies from Brazil looking for new lands in Colombia, in Beni, of course, and it's around these areas in the forest. Yeah, and who's going to construct these highways? Maybe Odebrecht from Brazil, yeah, or maybe the Chinese. Who's going to construct the hydroways connecting the coltan mines near the Venezuela border? Of course, the Chinese. So this is a clear market of lands, and our countries are in the middle of, and the Amazon forest is in the middle of this market. Who's going to take advantage? I don't know. Maybe the same one of all times. But our countries are not prepared, and I'm only sure it's only prepared. I don't know if they have the enough commitment to stop it in this moment. And another point I wanted to talk about, another type of tipping point in the case of Colombia and advance of deforestation during the last 20 years. And it's maybe in the areas near the Andes, right? And this type of landscapes is more resilient than the landscapes that they are now going more closer to the Guiana Shields landscapes. So this type of landscape is absolutely a sensitive areas that has not the same capacity to resilience in comparison with the Andes zones. So it's an early warning about what's happening now. And these areas are designated as protected areas and indigenous reserves or forest reserves, but we have not only more space to permit this deforestation process and not become in a tipping point in terms of biodiversity losses.
Thank you. Okay, we have a lot of questions. I got one over here, and one over here. Sure, order doesn't matter.
My name is Luis Gilberto Murillo. I'm former Minister of Environment of Colombia. Excellent panel. But my question is more in terms of the vision. When you took the different actors that have to do with the Amazon, at the international level, at the national level, even at the local level, there is not shared vision for the Amazon. Keeping in mind what the sign is saying. So it's how, and that's a big difference with the current government. We have a vision for the Amazon with President Santos. It's like environment and peace. And the key is how you construct that vision and how you communicate that vision. Because when you talk in Colombia about the Amazon, people don't care much. They care more about cutting trees in Bogota, than losing 100,000 hectares in the Amazon. So that's a problem that I would like to hear more from you about that. The second is how you define a strategic framework for really responding to the challenge of the Amazon. because the lack of coordination is huge. And you can take some examples from my own experience. Take the coordination between countries. Military in Brazil are very skeptical about joint work in the Amazon, and that's something that needs to be talked about. We tried with Santos to do something jointly just for the Northern Amazon, and we couldn't. In Brazil, everybody wants, except the military. That's a problem. So you have to have that joint framework that everybody feels comfortable. And also the multilaterals that are funding infrastructural projects that are against the goals of conservation and sustainable development. Political clout. I agree. So it's how you define that institutional framework, how you communicate it, and I want to hear more from you about that, and what is the implication for U.S. policy? What is the implication for U.S. policy? Because if you talk about, just take Colombia, the most important thing for the U.S. policy is eradicating coca without caring about the implication for deforestation. So that's something that needs to be reviewed, and there are key things. Rodrigo, who he's very good on those issues, said is like, you have to talk about property rights, and about to hear more about the role of technology. We need to talk more about the role of technology, and the role of new voices. I have resistance within the Ministry of Environment for issues of putting on the table blacks and indigenous. That are the areas that are more in good shape. And to talk about local issues that you mentioned. So it's how you define the framework, and I think it's relevant for, I agree with what you said about having a vision, construct that vision, and to see what is the implication for this, for policy in the US and other countries. And also the politics and the economics of this. This is why we don't have huge constituency, because people at the local level, they are very concerned about their income and to have normal life. They don't see that happening through conservation. And the second is how you can really have enough power to counteract the power of those in Colombia, the rural member of Congress that are pushing a very different vision for development. I wanted to hear you talking more about that technology, the vision, the role of communication, and the role of new voices. New voices. Those who really, culturally, Brigitte Batiste, who is a very, very good friend of us, and Rodrigo too, he said, conservation is a cultural act. So those who really historically has protected those areas need to be on the table. So I want to hear more you about that.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the woman over here, and then I'll go to the other side.
Hi, everyone. My name is Thalita Pessoa. I'm originally from São Paulo, Brazil. I'm pursuing a master's foreign service in Georgetown. Maybe my question is a nice follow-up to your question. I was thinking about when we were talking about this new vision for the Amazon, are the difference of actors and interests. I was thinking of OCTA. It's an organization that was founded 40 years ago with the Treaty of Cooperation between the countries, among the countries that have the Amazon. Do you see any role? Do you foresee any importance, or is it okay? Because it was more of a defensive thing. Yeah, I was curious what relevance it can have, and if not, why, and what do we do with it? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have one more question. The man with the white shirt.
I'll be brief. President of International Investor, I like the gentleman's comments in particular from Colombia. It seems for over half century, some would argue 2 centuries, we've been fighting a drug war. There's been no results. And the biggest problem is it's not supply, it's demand. I see a very good report here, great analytics. You really made some terrific observations and factual points, but I don't know if the conclusions really fit the results you seek. Most of these conclusions deal with environmental land management policy, and what you really need to focus on is the demand side. And what am I talking about? Every one of these countries is being pushed to export more and more of these food products to China and other markets. Is that really the answer? Because you can try as hard as you might, but both legally and illegally, the production will continue for centuries, I argue, until you stop the demand side.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, so I'm just going to ask each of you to respond quickly, and then we'll have to wrap up. Tom, would you like to? I guess we'll just go in order.
Well, I'd just like to respond to your point. I think your most fundamental point, which is how many voices have to be part of this discussion in arriving at a vision that is shared. You were so right on the mark about that, because you could create the identical vision, but without their participation, you won't have their engagement.
Just adding to that, I would also recognize the role of indigenous communities, traditional peoples, and quilombolas, which actually forms one of the tenets, not to go back to the Fundación Getulio Vargas guidelines, but for a locally led territorial vision. That's at the local level, but I would also say that it has to be both bottom up and top down. So there needs to be a nice balance there. And while I think a regional vision makes sense, regional as in multi-country, the local needs are so diverse in these communities that I would just suggest that it has to have both aspects. I think that there is an interesting question around the commodities market. I would just say that economists, particularly the OECD, has done a lot of research on regional development dynamics in Latin America, and I think everyone agrees that the sort of the raw commodities-based market from the sourcing side has definitely kind of reached, at least from an economic growth perspective, some stagnation. So I think there's an incentive on the country's parts to start to look for new economic development opportunities. And on the demand side, certainly agree that there's a lot of work to be done on that side as well. And there are lots of deforestation-free commitments and other kinds of mechanisms that exist internationally. And we're seeing those with varying degrees of success, but certainly a lot of visibility, and hope that with that visibility, we can increase those commitments and the enforcement of those commitments over time.
I think the points that you raised, Luis Gilberto, could take an hour to discuss, but I totally agree with the idea of the vision. I would also add to that we need to change the narrative of how we communicate what we have in hands. If we keep talking about all the negative things and how much we are doomed, we're just going to avoid it. It's like the reaction to when something is so bad is just you want to put your head in a hole. We have to realize what it actually gives to us, what it brings us, and then it becomes to be a cultural act. And that narrative is the vision, is the strategy, has to reflect the strategy of voices, who, and how do we manage better technology for communicating. But I will start with the fact that, things are not, it's not going to help us to be just, highlighting how screw up we are. I will start with that. I don't know if I leave that there.
I'm going to continue talking about the case of Colombia and your questions, Gilberto. First, what's going to happen if the Colombian government will spray the coca crops? It will be maybe starting a new war, a local war, clearly. And I have been working with the Colombian government 10 years ago, and I know that people is waiting this moment. People is waiting this moment. People is they need to have the last chance to be citizens of Colombia. That's what they are asking. They're not asking for economic development. No, they're asking for civilian rights. This is my experience and my local experience, and I think it will be very, very, very difficult because there are now stronger groups working, and of course, as you said, the demand is growing up. The demand is growing up, and we have now, not only with Venezuela, a lot of hydro highways of illegal economies, and specifically with gold, arms, and cocaine. We have also with the Brazilian border. Specifically now, in the Colombian Amazon, there is a lot of illegal roads going with drugs through Brazil to the Guyana to create this line of trade with West Africa, right? Going then to Europe. But why this drug is going to Europe, maybe the governments and other allies, in this case US, didn't do anything, right? So it's clear a problem of demand, yeah. And the spread will only spread also the problems, because there is not an integral policy about how to work with people and how to work with the most vulnerable people. And I'm going to put two examples. First of all, the most important indigenous reserves in the Colombian Amazon is now being invaded. And nobody's talking about it. We're only talking about the national parks or maybe the forest reserve, but nobody's talking about the indigenous reserves. A lot of vulnerable and people that is through extinction, they're being invaded, and nobody's talking about it. And they're talking not only for cocaine crops, they're specifically changing in this change that I have mentioned, in this change to going through agribusiness. So agribusiness is now the new expectation, right, to do the best laundry of legal and illegal money inside the forest, even in indigenous reserves, forest reserves, and maybe in some protected areas. So we need to pay attention and involve and engage vulnerable populations like the campesinos, the peasants, and indigenous, right? Because they are the shield, the governance shield that we need there. So it's all.
Thank you. Well, we're out of time, but I want to thank everyone for coming and your great questions, and especially thank our speakers for this very interesting discussion. Hope to see you again at a dialogue event soon. Thank you.